Boros, and we're back with the Masters class. And you might be wondering, did we have enough of Vishy? Did we have enough of Vishy? We never have enough of Viswanathan Anand. You'll have to see him live in St. Louis playing against the legendary, the best player of all time, Garry Kasparov. He's going to be playing that match in the format of 960, which will be a very special event. And of course, you can go and get autographs. There will be autograph sessions. And if you think, oh, so it's just going to be the Vishy-Kasparov match? No. No such thing happens at the chess club. There's also going to be the US champs and clutch chess. Meaning, you're going to see Gukesh, Carlsen, Fabiano, and Hikaru playing in an all-play-all tournament. You get to see them live at the chess club. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the practical world champions. What's fascinating is that when we talk Bobby Fischer, everyone believes that he's a very practical player, and of course it is true. But contrary to what people believe, Tal was also an incredibly practical player, and Vishy is the definition of being practical. So we're going to start off with Vishy's game against a French Grandmaster Moussard, and then we continue from there and take a look at a Tal classic. So, e4, e5, Vishy is playing white, and it is the Russian defense, aka the Petrov. d4, knight takes, bishop d3. Now there's of course the main line. Knight takes e5 is played in the big match between Kasparov and Karpov. Vishy chooses the other main line, d4, knight takes e4, bishop d3. Now, I'm going to test you all if you know the options that black can play in this position, because black's next move is somewhat cheeky, but also a playable option. So I wonder if you know what moves can black try out and play. Knight c6 indeed. It's a very funny little move. It feels like something is about and it's wrong. But the thing is, if white takes, black can go d5. The bishop surprisingly doesn't really have a good square to go to apart from back, but then it's a fork. So knight takes e5, knight takes e5, pawn takes, knight c5, knight c3, d6. And we get a situation where in the middle things are starting to get clarified, which is more of in the interest of black than white's. But let's try to find Vishy's next move that keeps the game rolling and is also a little bit of a tactical idea. Because otherwise, black is threatening to just simply snag the pawn on e5. Sort of a typical trick. In the Danish gambit, it doesn't quite work as charmingly as it does here. Indeed, bishop to c4. The point being, you can't touch that pawn. I take here. If you go here, another check. If you take here, I do take your lady. This doesn't really work in e4, e5 openings in many other cases because the knight is not in the way. There's no knight there. And bishop b4 check is the reason why the Danish gambit isn't quite winning for white. Meaning accepting the gambit isn't. So of course, we're seeing two grandmasters playing, so that's not going to happen. Bishop e6, trades, queen f3, pawn to c6. And again, you might notice that the dynamism of white's position is sort of fading, but what is happening doesn't mean that you have to give up of trying to go for more. So the question is, how can Vishy try to keep the pressure going? What would help and keep some chances for the world champion? Now, of course, we want to take that pawn. You got no choice. But we still have some choices here. Of course. That's right, Nick. Go bishop d2, castle long. Sometimes even by the fact that you're going to castle on the opposite side of the board gets and gives a little bit of extra tension. Now, if you're wondering that, hey, well, this doesn't look like a lot of an advantage for white, you're not wrong. White might have a nibble of an advantage, but not a lot. If we're trying to evaluate it objectively, black is not doing that bad. It's probably closer to equality than white having an advantage. So rook e8, rook e1, rook d8, queen g4. And what white is trying to do, and that's what I find specifically Vishy's style, he is trying to slowly build the position, even if on surface you might not see much happening. Queen g4, knight c5. And knight c5 is that typical case that black indeed is doing okay, but he needs to do something, and also is not a big fan of Vishy going knight to e4. So let's try and find Vishy's next move here. And it's going to be, again, just trying to fish for some weaknesses in black's camp. By the move in itself isn't spectacular, though. You could go bishop h6. But bishop h6, I mean, I see bishop h6, g6, back, but also black can just go bishop f8. Bishop h6 is a little bit too direct. h4 is sort of the direction more like what Vishy is hoping to do. Bishop g5. Now h4, of course, is a fine move, and that's definitely in the realm of probing black's position. It's not changing the fact that black is doing decently, but white is trying for something. Vishy is going for bishop g5, and bishop g5 is even more restrained. That's the way I would put it, because it's not actually creating more pawn weaknesses in the position. h4 would, loosen the structure a little bit. Bishop g5 isn't taking additional risks. Black takes, which is of course not necessary. Black could even consider moving the rook away, but that feels a little bit passive. So takes, queen c8. Of course, white doesn't want to trade. Rook f8. And now we're kind of getting into the situation where white is actually getting closer to a position that's much more comfortable than before. So we sort of want to decide, what are we going to target as white in this case? Because black is sort of all over the place. The queen, rook, bishop, knight, they're all over the place right now. Really the question is, how can we bank on it and take advantage of it rather? And often that is sort of connected on which side of the board you're going to play on. And Vishy, I do believe he's been signaling that with his moves. Well, if you go bishop e7, black, luckily for him, can still go rook to e8. Yeah. I think your mic slipped down a little bit. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, we want to play on the queen side. Bishop e7, unfortunately, as I said earlier, rook e8 is an issue. So what white decides, okay, not going to checkmate black anytime soon, so may as well shift gears over here. So queen c7, rook d1, pressing on that bishop. And that, again, is sort of that incremental chess that Vishy is known for. That bishop on d6 can't really be readily supported by that rook on d8. You can't just go rook d8, I capture you. So you are sort of forced to move that bishop. Takes, queen d4, a5. And here comes the part, what I would call unforced errors. Much like in a different sport, and this time let's just call it tennis, your opponent starts drifting, and a5, even though looks decent, white is actually quite well prepared with that. Now a5 by itself is not tragic, but it's a step in the wrong direction. So f4, b5. Now if a5 was inaccuracy, b5 is getting closer to a mistake. Now why do you guys and ladies think why b5 is somewhat suspicious from a strategical standpoint? The c pawn is a target. That is indeed correct. Black is sort of playing the position like he is going to be able to checkmate white, but that's not the case. White goes off after the trade, queen d2, and takes on d2. Rook takes d2, and suddenly we get into an ending that looks a little bit, agent sleeper, really tedious. But in fact, because this pawn on c6 doesn't really have a pawn defending it, it's not as drawish as one would believe. Rook c8, knight e2. And knight e2 is a very smart move by Vishy. Many of us often rush getting the rook to a good spot, but it would actually just help black out, going king to f8, king to e7, just harassing that rook. With Vishy going knight e2 now, black can't quite just do that. King f8, knight d4, and this maneuver is quite a good idea also because black can't just go king e7, I go knight f5 check with the tempo, and then you'll have to go back and be incredibly passive. So black again will have to invest and go pawn to g6. So we definitely made some headways in this position. The question so far though is how we can even move forward from here. And if not that, how can we also, or maybe at least, misplace our opponent's pieces? The knight? Oh, you meant c4, I guess. But if you go c4, for one I could take, I can push, but okay, maybe that's not what you meant. Okay. Uh-huh. You can go knight f3, knight e5, rook e2, f5. So what these chess players do is that they actually focus their play on one side of the board. If we would go f5, I mean, there is occasions when they kind of diversify their play, and then you'll see something like that even in this one. But for now, we are kind of trying to play against these, mostly the c6, b5 complex and the knight. So he actually goes rook e2. Now, that doesn't mean that f5, knight f3 can't be good. It's a different strategy. In fact, knight f3, knight e5 definitely makes sense. But here he is introducing potential ideas of rook to e5, actually messing around with the knight on c5 there. And again, notice, and this is what makes world champions so strong. There's a reason that Vishy is one of the GOATs, like Kasparov. So if rook e8, I will trade and the pawn drops. So in fact, white actually can claim, at minimum, a slight advantage because this rook on c8 is condemned to defend the pawn on c6. Knight b7, black voluntarily moves away, pawn c3. Again, sort of gives black the chance to make a move on their own. b4, and b4 again might be a bit too much. Black is playing like he's got the advantage, but in fact probably should be stationary and hoping that white can't find a chink in his armor. King c2, fairly straightforward play. He's not really rushing too much. c5, again, just making it easier for Vishy. a4, knight e5, just improving his pieces. And again, even in endings, sometimes just by the sheer fact that black has so many targets, the position becomes winnable. Now, we got our knight on e5. Let's say black just sits still. How could we try to milk this position and try to win if black does absolutely nothing and just sits? What would be our game plan? How would we be able to find targets in black's position? Okay, so you want to bring your knight to attack the a pawn. How would you do that?
The only way right now is knight c4, knight b6.
Okay, so you go knight c4, knight b6. What if I try to stop you? Of course, if the knight moves to c4. I mean, that's fair, that's fair. What I mean by nothing is that they will respond to your threats. But they're kind of just in a state of waiting for you to do something. If you do something, they will respond. They're not going to let you take the knight.
Oh, wait. You go knight d7 check and then knight b6?
Okay, so that's what I was referring to. They are going to see tricks. So it's actually like it is black's move right now. So I can go rook c7. I'm not going to fall for the knight d7 idea. Now I should have added that point. Yes, Nick?
I want to make the rooks more active, and I'm thinking bring it d2 to d7, and if they defend f7, I can go after their a pawn with rook a7.
Okay, but let's say black does go rook c7.
So if rook d2, rook c7, then rook d7 anyway.
Mm-hmm. Now, but let's start with the first and most important thing, and we kind of talked about it. What are the bigger weaknesses in black's camp? Well, yeah, but by in itself that a king is cut, that's not gonna win us the game. What are the biggest target in black's position?
The pawns are overextended.
Exactly. So these pawns are overextended. Now, as the wise grandmasters say, a pawn is only weak if you're able to attack it.
You have to unpin the king.
Now, how will this pawn become visible for us? Meaning, we'll be able to attack it with pieces. You can go rook e4 by in itself, as you point out correctly. We are in this pin. So if you go here, notice I have 1, 2 attacking. There's also this check. Is there anything else we could try to do with the b pawn? Is a3 a move? Absolutely, a3 is a move. So the point being, this happens in the game, knight c4, but the whole idea will be is that Vishy is going to set up rook e4, a3, and even if they keep pushing the pawn forward, the a pawn is isolated from the bunch and in fact is a weakness. And that's what I meant by making the a4 pawn visible. You will have, like you go a3, rook e4, you have 1, 2 pieces attacking. You might even take the pawn without getting exposed to this check. So let's see how Vishy did it. Knight c4, rook e4, knight e5 back, just messing with the opponent, and now goes a3. And the reason why this is kind of painful for black, because your knight is not participating, and even if you start trading, well, you just drop the pawn on a4. And even though it's not the final reason black is in trouble, the king, as you said, is cut off and far away, and we have a strong a pawn and a weak c pawn, most likely just easily winning. But it's very important if you can actually go after, and the point being really is that you're trying to initiate trades that expose more weaknesses. Trading by in itself is not a mistake. The fact that you could go after the pawn with that is the main idea. So b3, king d3, and sometimes we get scared, for the right reasons, that, oh, they actually fixed our pawn on b2, but black really doesn't have enough pieces, a to invade, b to even attack it. Not with a knight on b7. It's what we call a fianchettoed knight, and that's never really meant as a compliment. Yeah, those black pawns are fixed, and this is in some sense even worse, because if this falls, most probably the b pawn falls as well. So it is in some ways a mistake. Pawn to f6. Now, I do have to add one thing though, is that you still can't underestimate this pawn push. So I wasn't too complimentary when I talked about the b3 pawn push, but there definitely is one upside to it. There is a potential for some counterplay. If things go well for black, if the cards are played right, black might get some play against the b pawn. But, you know, the circumstances have to be right. So, black played pawn to f6. It is time for us to channel our inner Aliahin. everyone's favorite attacking world champion. So winning in chess is not easy, but whenever there's two sides of the board, Alekhine was famous for exposing both and trying to look for as many weaknesses as possible. And that is supposed to be a slight bit of a hint of what Vishy did next. F5, yes. And the point being, you are targeting these pawns. You make sure these pawns no longer are connected. Black takes, if he doesn't, then the H pawn becomes weak and this pawn actually pushed down. The king keeps being cut off. So therefore Black chooses the lesser of evils and takes on F5, Rook H4, but this time it's not only two weaknesses, it's three of them, and that obviously is quite enough. So King G7 takes the pawn, Rook H4. We don't really mind the ending. As we said earlier, too many pawns are weak, and the rook needs to help out, but can't. So here, knight f7, knight e3, check, c4 takes, knight e3, rook c6. So Black is sort of condemned of sitting. So the question is how we can move forward. Because of course if you move the knight, I will take on c4. Knight d3 is not sitting, but I will take that c4 pawn in a heartbeat. If you go here, I do take here, and you will lose this ending. The extra pawns are extra pawns for a reason. So even in positions of power where your pieces are dominating, you still want to check out what your opponent is doing and which one is their best piece. What is the last stronghold Black has? The knight, of course, but it is supported by the f-pawn, so it's not going to crumble by in itself. You have to do something about it. Well, if you go knight g4, I still threaten knight d3. You can't do it quite yet. So that is not an idea you want to do. But indeed, h4, g4, g5 is what Vishy is going for. But first, he stations the rook on e4. And the point being, once I go h4, g4, g5, the knight on e5 will be dethroned from that glorious square of e5. And black is just losing. g5 takes, pawn takes, not getting into any shenanigans. g6, just pushing the pawn. Black has to take, but as we said earlier, then white just takes everything. Check. And the rest was easy for Vishy. The king joins the fray. Check. King c4 takes the pawn. We take that. Check. And Moussard resigned. Quite a good game by Vishy, where he slowly but methodically nursed the tiniest of advantage into victory. Now, I want to show one more game, but this one, of course, is from the legendary Mikhail Tal. So let's dig into that. He played Gurgenidze, another strong grandmaster, and this actually features the Benoni. Takes, e4, rook e8, knight d2. So the thing with this opening, that it kind of leads to a lively play. I talked about in some of my lectures, you have to sort of understand every opening has a different principle behind it and a different goal. Now, Tal was always considered to be somewhat speculative, but that's actually not true. If you followed chess history, there were other world champions who weren't a big fan of Mikhail Tal. So there is a reason you hear all the time, Tal's sacrifices are incorrect. Yes, because they were considered not methodical enough. If you know, you know, there are world champions that actually preferred more methodical chess, and they weren't a big fan of Tal's play and his playing style, the chess that he's been playing and what made him such a fan favorite and a world champion. So knight a6, rook e1, knight c7, a4. Now, as before we get into the nitty-gritty of this quite quick game, meaning it's more of a miniature than anything else, it's not as long as the other game, what would you play here for a black? Well, someone is asking, is this from an online tournament? Nope, this is still the era when chess was still respected. But don't worry, that is coming back. It's gonna make a big time comeback because we are going to see more chess played over the board as people are getting sick of playing online. Well, sooner or later, people are going to realize the beauties of playing a live opponent and not one that was designed to be a computer. All right, so a4. Any ideas what you'd play here or play here for black? B6. And what will be your long-time and long-term plan, rather? Mm-hmm. And what makes all of you really gifted, because unlike the generations that are only listening to the electric genius, they all play a rook to b8, And Tal, of course, played b6, as suggested in the audience by Nick, and many of you as well. And it's actually fascinating how they're not considering b6 as one of the better moves because they don't like to listen to a human and very gifted world champion. They prefer a caged bot that never consented to play chess in the first place. So b6, well, what is the big deal? Why is b6 interesting and is different from rook to b8? Now, b6 is interesting because it gives a lot of options, as you'll see what happens later on. Rook b8 actually shows your hand. Computers don't actually care nor bother too much how many options your moves have. They actually try to find the best move, existing like the Incredible Hulk. They just go smash and that's it. Rook b8, it either is the best or not the best. It kind of depends on what happens later on. Both, of course, is a legitimate idea, but b6 is way more flexible, and flexible could sometimes be a better choice than trying to play the best move, or at least what the computer would suggest. So queen c2, knight g4. And what is fascinating with Tal's play is that Tal actually plays enterprising openings. It gives him options. White unsuspectingly went pawn to h3, and welcome to Tal's world. What do you think Tal should play in this position? Knight takes f2, of course, and people wonder, wait a second, how come this works? It works specifically because White's position and piece placement is a full-on garage sale. Everything is on top of each other. That's why Tal gets to sacrifice, because his pieces are well coordinated, as you'll see quite soon. King takes, of course, the only big question. Queen h4 check. If you push the pawn, you are going to get checkmated after bishop d4 in short order. King f1, bishop d4, and White went knight d1, saying, no biggie, I'm just gonna defend that square. Nothing is gonna happen in this position. So he thought, but so he was wrong. It's black to move and conquer all. Last but not least, your heart. Queen takes h3. Quite a brutal and beautiful sacrifice by Tal. Of course, can't touch this because he got mated by the two sneaky snipers all around the king. Nothing you can do about that. So you can't touch this. Can't touch that lady. And your king is actually in a bind with your queen, sort of far away from the action. So goes bishop to f3. Queen h2, of course. Now the king can go to e2, therefore you got to move the queen. So Tal is inching ever closer. Knight e3, f5. Obviously, you have to open up the position. Now, all of you people who really are hooked on computers and engines, it may come as a shock to you that black is actually dominating here. Yes, black is down a piece, but none of these pieces are contributing a lot to the defenses, while Tal's pieces, the queen, bishop, rook, pawn, and even the knight, you'll be surprised how much it contributes to the attack. So f5, knight c4. Here comes sort of the punchline of what we've discussed earlier. Can we just talk to our pieces? I'm not sure that's legal unless you're Smyslov. So if you want to whisper to your pieces, you want to take your chances now. Indeed, takes, and bishop a6. Not a careless whisper. Look how useful it was for us to play b6 instead of rook to b8. And you might be wondering, maybe Tal is actually quite a good player. And if you've seen his results, it might be even better than a computer stuck on your interface. So the bishop is putting a lot of pressure there. Bishop f3. Now, just like anything else, chess can become a party game, as it should be. And in any party game, the more, the merrier. So we may want to involve Alfred, who's still hanging out in the corner. So how can we involve as many pieces for the attack as we possibly can? Well, I'm all in for equal chances. It's not quite fair to pit Tal to something that is straight from the future, because Tal's chess in some sense was from the future, by the way. His way of playing in the poison pawn was sort of considered subpar, but engines actually later on said and nodded in agreement that he was actually correct. And if you see the game Rajabov Anand, it was proven that that poison pawn variation that Tal came up with was actually playable and a strong weapon for white. So, what is a rook if not doubled? It's time to double up the bubble up. Get the rook into the game. Rook a3. Again, mostly because white's pieces are scattered all around the board, they're not as strong. This rook especially is very, very misplaced. Rook e8, bishop d2, knight takes d5. Can't touch this, mate in 1. Bishop takes d5 check, rook takes d5. Again, no touchy, checkmate. King e2, but king e2 already loses because bishop takes e3, rook takes, bishop takes c4, and here white resigned because if you take, I take on g2, king d1, and queen takes d2 is checkmate. It's a glorious show of force by Mikhail Tal, and there is a fine reason why Fischer became an ardent fan of the Benoni, because of course he also was a big fan of the legendary magician of Riga. If they go king e1, the attack still keeps on roaming, and black is still up material as well. So, all right, so I really hope all of you enjoyed this lecture and hope to see you in the future as well.